Hi, welcome to Larson and Gill, Chapter 1. This is the chapter that really introduces you to the subject matter and kind of orients you to the perspective of the book. There is, like all the chapters, there are PowerPoint slides that go along with this chapter. I'm not going to spend time here on the video going through all of those slides, but I want to highlight a few things for you to emphasize kind of the story behind some of these items that you're going to see on the PowerPoint slides. The first thing I want to talk about is this notion of the rise of the individual self. And what this means is that the self, as we sort of understand it today, and by the self I mean an individual that is unique, has an identity that is separate from everything around us, and to think of ourselves that way is actually a pretty new orientation. In human history, more peoples have thought of themselves communally or in some sort of more kind of hierarchical way than in modern society, where we see ourselves, we see each individual as having a unique self. And, that provides a lot of really interesting opportunities. It also leads to a lot of interesting pressures, which we will talk about as we go through the class. The other way that I think that the individual self has risen is the rise of psychology as a interpretive frame. The discipline of psychology is relatively new in human history. And this notion that we each have a cognitive self and that there's something unique about each of ourselves that develops and grows over time is something that is unique. And not only has psychology a discipline been really important academically, but it's also seeped into popular culture. We now think of things like, having a consciousness or having an identity as something that is normal. And this is part of this discourse of psychology that has made a way of thinking about the human, the individual, something that is pretty unique and something that is a unique self. So it's a particular interesting time to study identity. And the reason for that is that you are living in a really interesting time of the world, right? We're in this globalized world. One of the biggest factors in that is the rise of communication technologies. The substance of our identities, like what is our identity? And my argument would be that it's communication, that it's stories. And one thing that communications technologies have done is made more stories available to us. What this means is that instead of just having one or two narratives that you might kind of use to define who you are, you now have dozens, hundreds, thousands of different possibilities that are available to you that you might look at and say, is that going to be my story, or do I want that to be my story? In the book, we talk about the idea of a Chinese peasant hundreds of years ago. A woman born into that society would not have had a lot of identity narratives available. In fact, there'd probably be one identity narrative that involves particular kinds of hierarchical roles, particular kinds of gender roles, particular kinds of economic roles. And as a result, that peasant's story would be largely formed very early on in life and would continue. Now, we live in a much more dynamic, interesting time. And you have so many possibilities for narrating yourself. Who am I? How do I want to act? Those are questions that are not completely predefined for us. We have many possibilities, and that's a really, really exciting thing. It's also sometimes a pretty scary thing. The other thing I think when we think about the self is that ourselves are not really monolithic. Right? I don't just have one identity. When I'm Greg, the dad, my my identity is different from Greg, the professor. And sometimes those two worlds collide. If I'm doing a Zoom meeting and my kids come into the room, right? Those are my two worlds colliding. And how do I manage that? Which identity comes forward in that time? And so we're going to talk about the self, not as just sort of monolithic, but as having many facets, and how those facets fit together, how they might compete. That is one of the more interesting things that scholars are studying. Third point here is that people spend considerable time and energy forming, shaping, and managing their identities. And we're going to refer to this during this class as identity work. And that's meant to be taken literally. It's work to form our identities. Sometimes it's exhausting work. Every day as we enact, we are presenting ourselves. We are presenting particular representations of our identity. When we tell stories about ourselves, when we dress a certain way, when we act a certain way, all of those things are messages about identity. And at the same time, we are reading the landscape and seeing if the messages that we tell about ourselves are reflected back to us by other people. So it's a very much a communicative, dynamic process where we spend this time trying to figure out, who am I? Trying to manage parts of our identities that may conflict, like the professor and the dad self. We have to spend a lot of time trying to deal with those kinds of things. And we're going to talk about that as identity work. Fourth, there is the notion of identity consumption. What this is saying is that we live in a time where, in a lot of ways, what's being sold to us in popular culture, in popular advertising, is identity messages. Think about a company like Nike. Nike really doesn't sell their shoes by saying, oh, look, we've got the best rubber compounds and these will, shoes will, feel better on your feet. They sell all about image and identity. If you wear these shoes, you are going to feel better. You're going to feel fit. You're going to just do it, meaning you're going to be that kind of person who goes out and seizes the day, seizes the world, right? They're selling an identity. And Nike's by far not the only company that does this. It is all around us. And so identity is something that we work on, but it's also something that we are consuming. As a final thing about this sort of increased possibilities, I want you to think about all of the self-help work that is out there. This could be the self-help literature. There's movies, there's books, there's seminars, there's all these kinds of avenues to try to create a better self. And in fact, that notion that that's something that we should be doing, right, is part of this focus on the self. We should always be striving to improve, to figure out who we are, and to become the best selves that we can possibly be. And so we're living in an interesting time, and that time makes identity something really important to study.